3 weeks into our Montana exile, the news came that I'd been both dreading and hoping for. Marcus Vance was dead. Not suicide, as they'd initially thought, but murdered by someone in his own network. Shot twice in the back of the head, execution style, in that same Tucson motel room where investigators had found his final packages. The killer had taken his laptop, his phone, and all physical records of the operation. "It's a cleanup," Detective Santos explained during a secure call to the cabin. "Someone's eliminating loose ends. The good news is that Vance's death probably signals the end of active operations. The bad news is that whoever killed him is still out there." But there was more. Hidden in Vance's motel room, investigators had found something that changed everything. A letter addressed to me, personally, in Jacob's handwriting. Somehow, Jacob had managed to get final instructions to Vance before his arrest. Instructions that were to be delivered only if the primary operation failed. The letter was short, just 3 paragraphs, but it explained everything I'd been wondering about for months. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means my first attempt failed and you've managed to involve law enforcement. I'm not surprised. You always were stubborn about refusing to learn lessons the easy way. You need to understand that I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to teach you, to show you what it feels like to lose everything because someone else decided your value. The way you decided mine wasn't worth investing in. The way Sarah decided I wasn't worth staying married to. The way every employer decided I wasn't worth keeping. But since you've chosen to make this complicated, the lesson will have to be more comprehensive. Sarah and the children will help you understand what loss really means. And then, when you've had time to think about it properly, when you've had time to realize that your choices have consequences, I'll finish what I started. This is love, Dad. This is what love looks like when it's honest about what it costs. Your son, Jacob." I read that letter 3 times, each reading making me sicker than the last, because buried in Jacob's twisted logic was a truth I'd been avoiding. He genuinely believed he was teaching me something valuable. In his mind, attempted murder was pedagogy, and systematic elimination was curriculum design. He wasn't just trying to kill us. He was trying to educate us about our own worthlessness. "Mr. Dalton," Santos said after I'd finished reading, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." "Go ahead." "Is there any chance at all, that your son might have additional resources we don't know about? Other contacts, other sources of support?" I thought about Jacob's childhood, his adolescence, the young man he'd been before everything went wrong. I thought about friends, teachers, employers, anyone who might have maintained loyalty to him despite everything that had happened. And then I remembered something that made my hands go cold. "Detective," I said slowly, "Jacob has a half-brother." Santos sat up straighter. "Half-brother?" "Linda's son from her first marriage, Danny Reeves. He's about 10 years older than Jacob, lives somewhere in California. They weren't close growing up. Danny was already out of the house when Linda and I got married, but they reconnected a few years ago." "Mr. Dalton, why didn't you mention this before?" "Because I haven't thought about Danny in years. He and Jacob only started talking after Linda died. Some kind of shared grief thing, I guess. But Detective, Danny served in the military. Special forces. He knows about weapons, tactics, surveillance." Santos was already reaching for her phone. "I need everything you know about Danny Reeves. Full name, last known address, service record, any contact information you might have." I gave her what I could, but it wasn't much. Danny had been a ghost in our family, present for Linda's funeral, polite during the brief conversation we'd had afterward, but essentially a stranger to me despite being my stepson for nearly 30 years. "Frank," Santos said after making several calls, "we can't locate Danny Reeves. His last known address was vacated 8 months ago. No forwarding information, no current employment, no recent credit activity. He's in the wind. Or he's been planning this as long as Jacob has." That night, lying in a cabin bedroom that smelled like pine needles and federal anxiety, I finally understood the full scope of what we were facing. This wasn't just about one angry son with access to poison. This was about a network of people who'd turned murder into a business model, with Jacob as both client and collaborator. And somewhere out there, Danny Reeves, a man trained in military tactics and gifted with operational invisibility, was carrying out his half-brother's final instructions. The children were no longer just potential victims. They were mission objectives. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the Montana wilderness under a sky so full of stars it hurt to look at directly. Somewhere in that vastness, a man I'd known peripherally for decades was hunting my grandchildren with professional precision and family motivation. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it clarified something I'd been struggling with since Jacob's arrest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't about waiting for law enforcement to solve the problem or hoping that Jacob would eventually come to his senses. This was about war. A war that Jacob had declared and that I was finally ready to fight. Because some things are worth dying for, and sometimes the people you love are worth killing for too. 6 months later. Danny Reeves made his move on a Thursday morning in March while the children were at a temporary school in Missoula, and Sarah was meeting with federal prosecutors about victim compensation. He came at the cabin like a professional. No noise, no wasted motion, neutralizing the perimeter security with the kind of efficiency that spoke to years of specialized training. By the time the federal agents realized they were under attack, Danny was already inside the building. But he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed I was just another civilian victim, an old man to be eliminated quickly and quietly before moving on to the primary targets. He hadn't counted on the fact that I'd spent 2 years in Korea, learning how to kill people who were trying to kill me. And he definitely hadn't counted on the fact that I'd been waiting for him. The final confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, Danny Reeves was dead on the cabin floor, and I was standing over him with Linda's old .38 revolver in my hand, the gun I'd kept hidden in my bedroom closet for 15 years and never thought I'd need to use. The federal agents found evidence in Danny's vehicle that revealed the full scope of the operation: detailed surveillance photos of the children, floor plans of their schools, scheduled elimination dates for everyone on Jacob's list. Sarah and the kids were finally safe. But that safety had come at a price I'm still calculating. Because when I pulled that trigger, when I watched Danny Reeves fall backwards with his eyes wide and surprised, I became something I'd never been before. A killer. Not a soldier following orders or a man defending his country, but someone who'd chosen to take a life in cold blood. The shooting was ruled justified. Self-defense and defense of others. No charges were filed. The FBI praised my decisive action in neutralizing an active threat. But Jacob's final lesson had been taught anyway. He'd wanted me to understand what it felt like to cross a line you can't uncross, to become someone you never thought you'd be, to carry the weight of another person's death for the rest of your life. Mission accomplished. Wesley Morrison recovered fully, though he never developed a taste for whiskey again. Carolyn sends me a Christmas card every year, signed with gratitude that feels heavier than it should. Detective Reyes got promoted to sergeant and still stops by occasionally, usually with coffee and conversation that carefully avoids the topic of family. Travis Beck moved to Florida and opened a small garage specializing in classic car restoration. He sends me photos sometimes, beautiful machines brought back to life through patience and skill. Sarah and the children live in Oregon now, under new names and new identities. I get letters occasionally, carefully generic updates that tell me they're safe without revealing anything that could be traced. Emma is learning piano. Tyler has joined Little League. Sarah is teaching again, 3rd grade, helping other people's children learn to read and write and believe in their own futures. I still live in the same house, though I've updated the locks and installed a security system that probably costs more than it should. The kitchen table where that bottle once sat now holds my morning coffee and the newspaper. Nothing more dramatic than crossword puzzles and local weather forecasts. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that moment in the Montana cabin when I made the choice to become a killer. I think about Danny Reeves falling backward, the surprise in his eyes, the way his breath left him all at once like air from a punctured tire. I think about Jacob in his prison cell, probably smiling as he reads news reports about his half-brother's death, satisfied that he'd finally taught me what loss really felt like. And I think about the children, my grandchildren, growing up with new names in a new state, learning to trust the world again despite everything their father had tried to take from them. That's the real lesson in all this. Not that family will betray you, or that trust is dangerous, or that love can be weaponized. The real lesson is that some people are worth protecting, no matter what it costs you. Even if the cost is your soul. Even if the price is becoming the very thing you swore you'd never be. Even if saving them means damning yourself. I keep Linda's 38 in the kitchen drawer now, loaded and ready. Not because I expect trouble, but because I've learned that expecting trouble and being prepared for it are two different skills entirely. And I've learned something else too. Something that Jacob, for all his planning and preparation and systematic approach to murder, never understood. The people you tried to why. The last gift. The morning I turned 71, death arrived wrapped in velvet paper with a gold ribbon. I didn't know it then, of course. Standing in my kitchen with that package in my hands, all I saw was expensive whiskey and familiar handwriting, the kind of script I'd watched develop over homework assignments and birthday cards for 2 decades. My son Jacob's handwriting, unmistakable as his mother's eyes or the scar above his left eyebrow from the bike crash when he was 12. 3 years. 3 years since we'd spoken. 3 years since he'd walked out of this house after I refused to co-sign another loan. 3 years of silence so complete it had its own weight, pressing down on Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, until I stopped setting a place for him entirely. And now this. A bottle that cost more than my monthly grocery bill, delivered without warning on the anniversary of my birth. The whiskey was beautiful, I'll give it that. Crystal clear glass that caught the October light streaming through my kitchen window. The label was deep emerald green with gold lettering so crisp you could feel the raised edges under your fingertips. Blackwood Reserve, 25-year single malt. Limited edition. The kind of bottle you display on a shelf and tell stories about. But Jacob didn't know, or maybe he'd forgotten, that I'd stopped drinking the day Dr. Martinez explained what my heart attack had stolen from me. The list was long. Red meat, salt, stress, and yes, alcohol. 3 years of sobriety weren't a choice anymore. They were survival. I set the bottle on my kitchen table and stared at it while my coffee went cold. The card taped to the side was simple white paper folded once. Inside, just 2 words in that careful penmanship. Happy birthday. No dad, no signature, no explanation for the years of silence. Just those 2 words standing naked on the page like they were afraid to say more. The rational thing would have been to call him. Thank him. Maybe crack open that door we'd both been pretending didn't exist. But something in my gut whispered, careful. The same instinct that had kept me alive in Korea, the one that made me check shadows before stepping into them. Instead, I thought of Wesley Morrison. Wesley lives about 4 miles east, where the county road turns to gravel and the mailboxes get farther apart. He's the kind of neighbor who shows up with his tools before you've finished explaining what's broken. Last spring, when a tornado came close enough to rearrange half my shed, Wesley was hammering new boards to the frame while I was still sweeping glass from the kitchen floor. If anyone deserved something beautiful, it was him. By noon, the bottle was secure in my passenger seat, and I was driving through the kind of autumn that makes you understand why poets never shut up about October. The maples were burning red and gold, and the air carried that crisp promise of winter coming but not yet arrived. Wesley's house sits at the end of a dirt road, a modest ranch with a garden that puts mine to shame and a workshop that smells like sawdust and possibility. His wife, Carolyn, answered the door, flower on her apron, that warm smile that makes you feel like family even when you're not. Frank Dalton, she said, stepping aside. What brings you out here? Got something I thought Wesley might appreciate, I said, holding up the bottle. Wesley emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He's one of those men who's built like a tree trunk, solid, reliable, deeply rooted. When he saw the bottle, His eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Frank, this is something special. Where'd this come from?" "Jacob," I said, the name feeling strange on my tongue after so long. "Birthday gift. Figured you'd get more joy from it than I would these days." Wesley took the bottle carefully, turning it to catch the light. The liquid inside was amber fire, dark honey, liquid gold, all those cliches that suddenly made sense when you saw a whiskey this fine. "You sure about this?" he asked. "This had to cost—" "Tonight's special enough," I interrupted. "Make tonight the reason to open it." His grin was wide and genuine. "Carolyn, we're having ourselves a celebration." I left them making plans for dinner, feeling lighter than I had in months. There's something about giving a gift to someone who'll treasure it that settles right in your chest. The drive home was peaceful, the autumn light painting everything with that golden brush that makes even the ordinary look blessed. That peace lasted exactly 19 hours. But before I tell you about the call that changed everything, I need you to understand something about Wesley Morrison. Wesley isn't just a neighbor who happens to live down the road. He's the man who taught my son how to fish when Jacob was 8, and I was working double shifts at the plant. He's the one who drove me to the hospital the night Linda had her stroke, sitting in that waiting room until 4 in the morning, even though he had work the next day. When Linda died, Wesley was the one who helped me pick out her headstone. We spent 3 hours at the monument company, looking at granite samples and bronze lettering, and when I couldn't decide between 2 inscriptions, Wesley said quietly, "Frank, pick the one that sounds like her voice." That's the kind of man he is. The kind who knows that choosing the right words for someone you love is sacred work. So when I handed him that bottle, I wasn't just giving whiskey to a neighbor. I was giving it to the closest thing to family I had left. The irony would have been perfect if it wasn't so goddamn evil. I'd spent that evening after dropping off the bottle feeling something I hadn't felt in years. The warm satisfaction of a gift well given. I'd even called Gary Hutchins to tell him about it, how Wesley's face had lit up when he saw that emerald label. "You did good, Frank," Gary had said. "Man like Wesley deserves something fine now and then." I'd gone to bed that night thinking maybe I'd found a way to honor Jacob's gesture without compromising my health. Maybe there was still room in this world for gifts that meant what they claimed to mean. I should have known better. In my experience, the moments when you think everything's finally falling into place are usually the moments right before the floor gives way. The call came at 7:30 the next morning while I was standing at the sink, watching steam rise from my first cup of coffee. The voice on the other end was tight with the kind of controlled panic that comes from too many hours in a hospital waiting room. "Frank, this is Carolyn Morrison." My hand tightened on the phone. "Carolyn, what's wrong?" "It's Wesley. He collapsed around midnight. We're at County General. The doctors—" Her voice cracked. "They think it might be poisoning." The coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering against the linoleum. Brown liquid spread across the floor like a stain that would never come out. "Poisoning?" The word tasted like metal. "They're running tests. Frank, he's in critical condition. The only thing different was—" She took a shaky breath. "That bottle. We shared it with dinner, just 1 glass each, but by 11 he was saying the room was spinning. By midnight I was calling 911. I closed my eyes. In the darkness behind my lids I saw Jacob's handwriting again. "Happy birthday." 2 words that suddenly felt like a signature on a death warrant. "I'm coming," I said. "No, wait. The doctors want to know everything about that whiskey. Where it came from, when you got it, if you noticed anything unusual." Unusual. Like the fact that my son, who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, had suddenly decided to spend more money than he'd ever spent on a gift. Like the fact that he'd chosen something he knew I couldn't use. Like the careful way he'd asked, during our brief phone call that night, whether I'd tried it yet. "Tell them it was unopened when I gave it to Wesley," I said. "And tell them I might have saved a sample." After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen, glass crunching under my boots, and felt the world tilt sideways. Because in my refrigerator, On the middle shelf behind the milk sat a mason jar with about 2 fingers of that same whiskey. I'd poured it out when Wesley and I had shared a taste before I'd given him the bottle. I'd kept it without thinking, the way you save the end of something good. Now it might be evidence, but first I had to deal with the glass on my floor and the terrible arithmetic forming in my head. If Jacob had planned this, really planned it, then he'd expected me to drink that whiskey myself. The fact that I'd given it to Wesley wasn't mercy on his part. It was a miscalculation, which meant somewhere in his mind he'd already moved past the idea of my death and was probably wondering why I was still breathing. I swept up the glass, each shard catching the light like tiny accusations. The coffee stain on the linoleum looked like a map of nowhere I wanted to go, but I mopped it anyway because sometimes you clean up messes just to prove you can still move your hands in straight lines. Then I opened the refrigerator and stared at that mason jar. The whiskey inside was beautiful, liquid amber that seemed to glow with its own light. If I didn't know what I knew, I might have been tempted to take just a sip, just to understand what $467 tastes like. But knowledge changes everything. That wasn't whiskey anymore. It was evidence. It was proof. It was the difference between Wesley Morrison dying and living. It was also probably the reason I was still alive. I called the only person I could trust with something this dark. Gary Hutchins runs a veterinary lab out of a converted garage on the edge of town. We'd served together overseas, and there are some bonds that outlast everything else. Wars, marriages, decades of civilian life. Gary's the kind of man who asks the right questions and keeps the wrong answers to himself. "Gary, I need a favor," I said when he picked up. "I need you to test something for me, quietly." "What kind of something?" "Whiskey, and maybe something that shouldn't be in whiskey." A pause. "Frank, you drinking again?" "No, but someone else did, and now they're in the hospital." He didn't ask for details over the phone. Smart man. "Bring it by after I close. Side door." That evening, I drove the mason jar to Gary's lab, my hands steady on the wheel but my thoughts racing like a freight train with no brakes. The lab occupied an old service station, the bay doors replaced with windows, the oil-stained concrete scrubbed clean but never quite forgetting what it used to be. Gary met me in the parking lot, lab coat over flannel, the smell of disinfectant and coffee clinging to him like a second skin. "This about Jacob?" he asked without preamble. "Maybe." He nodded, understanding in the way that only comes from shared trenches and shared silence. "I'll know by tomorrow." That evening I drove the mason jar to Gary's lab, my hands steady on the wheel but my thoughts racing like a freight train with no brakes. The lab occupied an old service station, the bay doors replaced with windows, the oil-stained concrete scrubbed clean but never quite forgetting what it used to be. Gary met me in the parking lot, lab coat over flannel, the smell of disinfectant and coffee clinging to him like a second skin. "This about Jacob?" he asked without preamble. "Maybe." He nodded, understanding in the way that only comes from shared trenches and shared silence. "I'll know by tomorrow." But as I drove away from Gary's lab, something else was nagging at me. A memory I couldn't quite catch, like trying to remember a dream after the alarm clock has already dragged you back to consciousness. It came to me as I was pulling into my driveway. The phone call. The night after I'd given Wesley the bottle, Jacob had called. Our first conversation in 3 years, and at the time I'd been so shocked to hear his voice that I hadn't paid attention to the details. But now, sitting in my truck with the engine cooling, the pieces started arranging themselves into a picture I didn't want to see. He'd asked if I'd enjoyed the gift yet. When I told him I'd passed it along to Wesley, there had been a pause, long enough for me to count my heartbeats. Then he'd asked almost casually, "When?" I'd told him we'd shared a glass that evening. Another pause, then, "How much did he have?" At the time, I'd thought it was conversation. Now I understood it was inventory. Jacob had been calculating in real time whether Wesley Morrison was going to live or die. Inside my house, I went straight to the kitchen phone and scrolled through the call log until I found it. There it was, Jacob's number, the night before Wesley collapsed, 7:43 p.m. Duration, 4 minutes and 16 seconds. I wrote down every detail I could remember from that conversation. Every question he'd asked, every pause, every inflection. Then I called Detective Reyes and left a detailed message on his voicemail. He called back within the hour. "Frank, that's important. We need to get that call detail record from the phone company. If Jacob was monitoring the situation, checking on his work, that shows consciousness of guilt." "Detective," I said, "there's something else." When I told him I'd given the bottle to Wesley, he didn't sound surprised. He sounded disappointed. Like he'd been expecting a different answer. Like he'd been hoping for one. That night I did something I hadn't done since my army days. I set up a perimeter watch. Not because I thought Jacob could reach me from jail, but because a man who keeps lists of names and dosage calculations doesn't usually work alone. I positioned a chair in my living room where I could see both the front and back doors, kept the curtains cracked just enough to monitor the street, left lights on in rooms I wasn't using, creating the impression of movement even when the house was still. It felt like overkill until 2:15 in the morning, when headlights swept across my front windows, slow and deliberate. The car, a dark sedan I didn't recognize, cruised past once, then again 5 minutes later. The third time it stopped directly across from my house. I moved to the window, staying in the shadows, and watched. The car idled for maybe 3 minutes, long enough for whoever was inside to study my house, note which lights were on, which rooms appeared occupied. Then it pulled away, no hurry, no drama, just a smooth exit that felt more ominous than any screech of tires could have. I didn't call the police. What would I have told them? That someone drove past my house in a car I didn't recognize? That I had a feeling in my gut that felt like a warning? But I wrote down the time, the description of the car, and the sick certainty that Jacob's arrest hadn't ended anything. It had just forced whoever was helping him to be more careful. I drove home through streets that felt different somehow, as if the darkness between the streetlights had grown deeper while I wasn't looking. At the house, I double-checked the locks, something I hadn't done since Linda died. Old habits, climbing out of storage when the world stops making sense. Gary called at 8:15 the next morning. His voice was granite. "Frank, you need to sit down for this." I was already sitting, but I gripped the kitchen table anyway. "Tell me, white snake root, concentrated extract, enough to kill a healthy man, let alone someone with a heart condition?" The words hit like a physical blow. I'd heard of white snake root. Farmers around here knew to keep their livestock away from it. But I'd never known it could be refined, concentrated, made into something invisible. "How much?" I asked. "Too much. Whoever prepared this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't accidental contamination, this is deliberate." I closed my eyes. Saw Jacob at 15, helping me fix the fence line, sweat on his forehead, pride in his eyes when I told him he'd done good work. Saw him at 25, asking for money again, anger flashing when I said no. Saw him 3 years ago, walking out of this kitchen with words that still cut. "One day you'll regret choosing everyone else over your own blood." "Gary," I said slowly, "I need you to call the sheriff's office, ask for Detective Reyes, tell him everything." "Already planning on it. Frank?" "Yeah?" "Be careful. A man who'd poison his father's whiskey isn't done being dangerous." The hours between Gary's call and Detective Reyes showing up at my door stretched like taffy. I tried to keep busy, sorted through papers I'd already sorted, checked the oil in my truck, started a grocery list I'd never finish. But my mind kept circling back to that mason jar, that golden liquid that looked so innocent sitting in my refrigerator. How long had Jacob been planning this? How many times had he sat in his kitchen or his garage or wherever he'd prepared that poison, thinking about me taking that first sip? Detective Reyes arrived just after 2, driving an unmarked sedan that looked like it belonged to a man who solved problems quietly. He was younger than me by 20 years, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing and forgave even less. "Mr. Dalton," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that said he took this seriously. I understand you may have information about a possible poisoning. I told him everything. The gift, the timing, Wesley's collapse, Gary's test results. I showed him the mason jar, still sitting in the refrigerator like evidence waiting for someone to claim it. Reyes handled it carefully, photographing it from every angle before sealing it in a plastic evidence bag. I'll need a formal statement, he said, and I'll need you to think carefully about any other interactions you've had with Jacob recently. Phone calls, messages, anything. That's when I remembered the phone call. The night after I'd given Wesley the bottle, Jacob had called. Casual conversation, or so I'd thought at the time. He'd asked if I'd tried the gift yet. When I told him I'd passed it along to Wesley, there had been a pause. Not surprise, something else. Something that sounded like calculation. He knew, I told Reyes. The moment I said I'd given it to Wesley, he knew something had gone wrong. Reyes wrote that down. Wrong for who? I met his eyes. For him. That evening, I visited Wesley at the hospital. He was conscious but weak, his skin the color of old newspaper. Carolyn sat beside him, knitting with fierce concentration, as if she could repair more than just yarn through sheer determination. How are you feeling? I asked, pulling a chair close to his bed. Like I got kicked by a mule, Wesley said, his voice barely above a whisper. But alive. Doctor said if I'd had more than one glass. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Wesley, I said carefully, I need to ask you something. Did that whiskey taste off? Different? He thought for a moment. Bitter at the end. But I figured that was just the age. Sometimes the expensive stuff has edges you don't expect. Edges you don't expect. If only we'd known how sharp those edges were. Reyes called that night. Lab confirmed Gary's findings. We're opening a formal investigation. I'll need to interview Jacob, probably tomorrow. Detective, I said, he's not going to just confess. He's smart, and he's had time to prepare for this conversation. I know. But smart men sometimes outsmart themselves. We'll see what story he tells. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house settling, every branch scratching against the roof, sounded like footsteps. I'd installed new deadbolts that afternoon, but metal can only keep out so much. It can't keep out guilt or fear or the sick knowledge that the person who wants to hurt you shares your last name. The interview was scheduled for 10 the next morning. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be there to know how it would go. Jacob would be polite, cooperative, and prepared. He'd express shock and concern about Wesley's condition. He'd have explanations for everything. Explanations that sounded reasonable until you looked at them too closely. Reyes called at noon. He's good, he said without preamble. Very good. Claims he bought the bottle from a collector online, paid cash, never opened it. Says he had no idea it was contaminated. You believe him? Hell no. But belief and proof are different animals. I need more than a poisoned bottle and a father's suspicions. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office. If Jacob had purchased that whiskey locally, there might be a paper trail. Credit card receipts, bank records, something to contradict his story about cash payments to anonymous collectors. The clerk was a pleasant woman named Betty, who'd been filing papers since before the building had computers. She helped me search through business license records looking for anyone in the county who might deal in rare spirits. There's only one, she said, pointing to a listing. Thompson's Rare Spirits, out on Highway 9. Been in business about 5 years. Thompson's turned out to be a small shop tucked between a tire store and a place that fixed lawnmowers. The owner, a soft-spoken man named Dale Thompson, recognized the bottle immediately when I described it. Blackwood Reserve, he said, nodding. Had 3 of those come in about 6 months ago. Sold 2, still got 1 in the back. My pulse quickened. Do you remember who bought them? He walked to an old computer terminal, fingers pecking at keys worn smooth from years of use. Let me check. Yeah, here we are. Sold one to a fellow named Jacob Dalton. Paid with a credit card. The world went still around me. You're certain? Transactions right here. April 15th. $467.32, including tax. April 15th. Tax day. 6 months before my birthday. 6 months to plan, to prepare, to let the idea of killing me marinate until it felt reasonable. I thanked Dale and drove straight to the sheriff's office. Reyes looked up from his desk when I knocked on his open door. "Frank, you look like a man who found something he didn't want to find." I told him about Thompson's shop, about the credit card purchase, about the 6-month gap between buying the poison and sending it to me. He took notes, asked for Dale's contact information, and made a phone call that would change everything. "We can get financial records now," he said after hanging up. If he lied about paying cash, that's another charge. And Frank? 6 months of planning. That's premeditation. The word hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. "Detective," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." "Shoot." "If this goes to trial, what are his chances?" Reyes leaned back in his chair, studying me with those sharp eyes. "Depends on what else we find." "But Frank, a man who'd poison his father's birthday gift, that's not someone who stops at one attempt." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "You think he'll try again?" "I think a man who keeps poison in his house has plans for it." That night I called my insurance agent and updated my beneficiaries. Not because I was giving up, but because hope and preparation aren't mutually exclusive. I also wrote a letter, sealed it, addressed it to Detective Reyes, and put it in my safe. Just in case. The search warrant came through 3 days later. I wasn't there when they executed it, but Reyes called afterward with an inventory that made my blood run cold. 17 glass vials containing various plant extracts, including white snake root. A digital scale accurate to the gram. A notebook filled with handwritten calculations, doses, body weights, time to effect. The word hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. "Detective," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." "Shoot." "If this goes to trial, what are his chances?" Reyes leaned back in his chair, studying me with those sharp eyes. "Depends on what else we find." "But Frank, a man who'd poison his father's birthday gift, that's not someone who stops at one attempt." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "You think he'll try again?" "I think a man who keeps poison in his house has plans for it." But Reyes didn't know about the car that had cruised past my house, and I found myself reluctant to mention it. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I was starting to understand that this investigation was bigger than one poisoned bottle. Jacob had help. Someone with access to refined toxins, someone who knew how to extract and concentrate plant-based poisons, someone who understood the precise calculations needed to kill without being detected. That night, I did more than update my insurance beneficiaries. I drove to the one place in town where I could think clearly, the old cemetery where Linda was buried. Her headstone was simple gray granite with her name, dates, and the inscription Wesley had helped me choose. "Beloved wife and mother, her voice lives on." I sat on the stone bench facing her grave and talked to her the way I used to talk to her across the kitchen table. "Our boy's trying to kill me, Lynn," I said to the cooling October air, "and I think he's got help doing it." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the oak tree that shaded her plot. If that was Linda's answer, I couldn't interpret it. But sitting there in the growing dusk, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced since this whole nightmare began. Jacob hadn't just betrayed me. He'd betrayed everything Linda and I had tried to teach him about love, loyalty, and the sacred trust between family members. And if he was willing to cross that line once, he'd be willing to cross it again. I drove home and called my insurance agent anyway. The search warrant came through 3 days later, but not before Jacob tried one more move. I was checking my mail Tuesday afternoon when I found an envelope with no return address, postmarked from 3 counties over. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message in block letters. Stop talking to cops or next time won't be whiskey. I stood at my mailbox for a long moment, reading those words again and again. The handwriting was different. Not Jacob's careful script, but someone else's blocky printing. Someone who wanted their message clear but their identity hidden. I took the letter straight to Reyes. "This changes things," he said, studying the paper under his desk lamp. "This is witness intimidation, federal mail crime, and it confirms what we suspected. Your son's not working alone. Can you trace it? The postmark helps. 3 counties puts it in state jurisdiction, but we can work with their people. And Frank?" He looked up from the letter. "This tells us we're on the right track. People don't threaten witnesses unless they're worried about what those witnesses might say." The search warrant was executed the following Thursday. I wasn't present. Reyes had strongly advised against it, but I drove past Jacob's house that afternoon and saw the evidence van in the driveway, crime scene tape fluttering in the October breeze like yellow prayer flags. The house looked smaller somehow, as if guilt had a way of shrinking the spaces where it lived. Reyes called that evening with an inventory that made my blood run cold. 17 glass vials containing various plant extracts, including white snake root, a digital scale accurate to the gram, a notebook filled with handwritten calculations, doses, body weights, time to effect. And in the garage behind a stack of lawn care equipment, a small refrigerator containing what appeared to be additional samples in various stages of preparation. "It's a lab," Reyes said, his voice grim. "A goddamn poison laboratory. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision, Frank. This was methodical, systematic preparation." "What else?" "Chemistry textbooks, internet printouts about toxicology, and that notebook. Jesus, Frank. It goes back 18 months. Detailed notes about extraction methods, concentration techniques, delivery systems." I closed my eyes, trying to reconcile the image of my son hunched over chemistry books with the boy who used to build model airplanes on this same kitchen table. The boy who'd cried when his goldfish died and insisted we hold a proper funeral in the backyard. "There's more," Reyes continued. "We found correspondence. Emails mostly, but also handwritten letters. Looks like he's been in contact with someone who calls himself the botanist. Real name appears to be Marcus Vance. He's got a record for manufacturing controlled substances." The botanist. The nickname was almost comical, except there was nothing funny about what it represented. Jacob hadn't just decided to kill me on his own. He'd found a mentor, someone to guide him through the technical details of murder. "Where's Vance now?" "Unknown. The address we have for him is a P.O. box in Arkansas that's been closed for 6 months. But we're working with federal agents to track him down. This kind of specialized knowledge doesn't exist in a vacuum." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and tried to imagine the conversations Jacob and this botanist must have had. The planning sessions, the technical discussions, the moment when theoretical knowledge became practical intent. Had they talked about me specifically? Had Jacob described my daily routines, my morning coffee, my evening meals? Had I been a case study in their twisted curriculum? And in the back of that notebook, a list of names. Mine was at the top, but it wasn't alone. "Who else?" I asked. "Wesley Morrison, Carolyn Morrison, someone named Travis Beck, apparently his former boss who fired him last year, and, Reyes paused. "His ex-wife Sarah. She's living in Arizona now, but Frank, she's the mother of his 2 kids. "Who else?" I asked. "Wesley Morrison, Carolyn Morrison, someone named Travis Beck, apparently his former boss who fired him last year, and..." Reyes paused. "His ex-wife Sarah. She's living in Arizona now, but Frank, she's the mother of his 2 kids." My legs went weak. I sat down hard in the kitchen chair, the phone pressed to my ear like a lifeline. "We're contacting all of them," Reyes continued. "Protective custody if necessary, but Jacob's not cooperating. Lawyer up immediately, won't say a word." "What about the kids?" "Safe. They're with Sarah's parents in Phoenix. Been there since the divorce finalized. But Frank, this list, it reads like a man settling scores." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the spot on the table where that beautiful bottle had caught the morning light just a week ago. But my mind was spinning through the implications of that list, trying to understand the logic that could put a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old on the same page as the man who'd fired their father. The truth was, there was no logic. There was only rage, systematic and cold, dressed up in careful planning and precise measurements. I needed to know more about Travis Beck. Beck's auto repair sat on the industrial side of town, wedged between a tire shop and a place that sold used farm equipment. The kind of neighborhood where the buildings lean against each other for support, and the parking lots are more pothole than pavement. I found Travis in Bay 3, bent over the engine of a pickup truck that had seen better decades. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with grease-stained hands and the kind of concentration that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing. "Travis Beck?" I asked. He looked up, wrench still in hand. "Yeah, that's me. You need work done?" "I need to talk to you about Jacob Dalton." His face changed instantly, the easy competence replaced by something guarded and hard. He set the wrench down carefully and wiped his hands on a rag that had given up being clean years ago. "What about him?" "He worked for you?" "For about 6 months. Until I caught him stealing from the register and had to let him go." "Why?" I told him. Not everything. I wasn't authorized to discuss an ongoing investigation, but enough. That Jacob was in custody, that there had been an incident involving poison, that Travis's name had come up in connection with the case. Travis went pale under the motor oil and grime. "Jesus Christ, you're serious. Dead serious. When's the last time you saw him?" "Month or so after I fired him. He came by, wanted to clear the air," he said. I told him there was nothing to clear. He'd stolen money from me, end of story. But he kept pushing, saying I'd ruined his reputation, cost him other jobs. Travis shook his head. Guy couldn't accept that actions have consequences. "He threatened you?" "Not directly. But he said something that stuck with me. Said I'd learn what it felt like to lose everything over someone else's decision. At the time, I figured it was just wounded pride talking. I felt that familiar chill. "Travis, you need to talk to Detective Reyes at the sheriff's office. Today." "You think I'm in danger?" I looked around the shop, the tools, the equipment, the coffee pot that had probably been brewing the same bitter batch since morning. All of it normal, every day, the kind of life Jacob thought Travis didn't deserve to keep. "I think you need to be very careful about what you eat and drink for a while." Travis called Reyes that afternoon. By evening, he was in protective custody, moved to a motel 2 counties over with a deputy stationed in the parking lot. It seemed like overkill until Reyes called me with an update that changed everything. "We found more correspondence with this botanist character," he said. "And Frank, they weren't just planning to use poison. They were planning to make it look like accidents. Heart attacks, strokes, sudden illnesses that would fly under the radar unless someone knew what to look for." I thought about Wesley's collapse, how easily it could have been attributed to his existing heart condition if we hadn't known about the whiskey. How I might have blamed myself for giving him something too rich for his system, something that pushed his aging body past its limits. How many others were they planning to kill? The notebook suggests at least 6, maybe more. We're still decoding some of the entries. 6 people. 6 lives. Jacob thought he had the right to end because they disappointed him, fired him, refused him, or simply existed in ways that inconvenienced his version of how the world should work. I spent that night going through old photo albums, trying to find the moment when the boy in those pictures had become the man planning mass murder in a garage laboratory. There was Jacob at 6, gap-toothed and grinning as he held up a fish almost as big as he was. Jacob at 12, serious and focused as he helped me rebuild the back porch steps. Jacob at 18, proud in his graduation cap and gown. Linda's arm around his shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun. When had pride become entitlement? When had disappointment become homicidal rage? Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe understanding wouldn't change anything. But as I closed the albums and prepared for bed, I made a decision that would shape everything that came after. I was going to testify, not just about the bottle or the phone call or the suspicious timing. I was going to tell the truth about who Jacob had been and who he'd become, even if it meant admitting that I'd failed as a father somewhere along the way. Because 6 people were alive because Wesley Morrison had survived that first glass of poison, and I'd be damned if I'd let false mercy put them back in danger. The preliminary hearing was set for the following Monday. Jacob's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Kellerman who looked like he'd never lost a case he cared about, tried to get the charges reduced, claimed the notebook was creative writing, and the vials were for botanical research. But Wesley Morrison's testimony cut through that fiction like a blade. Sitting in that witness chair, still pale but steady, he described the taste of that whiskey, the burning in his throat, the way his heart had started racing before everything went dark. "I've been drinking whiskey for 40 years, he told the jury. "I know the difference between aged complexity and something that doesn't belong." Jacob sat through it all with the blank expression of a man watching someone else's life fall apart. He didn't look at me, not once. But when the judge denied bail, flight risk, danger to the community, I saw his mask slip for just a moment. The rage underneath was pure and cold and familiar. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution painted a picture of meticulous planning. The purchase of the whiskey, the extraction and refinement of the poison, the careful calculation of dosages. They brought in experts who explained how white snake root worked, how it attacked the cardiovascular system, how it could be made virtually undetectable in a strongly flavored spirit. But the most damning evidence came from Jacob's own digital footprint. Email exchanges with Marcus Vance, the mysterious botanist, revealed a months-long correspondence that read like a masterclass in murder. Vance had provided detailed instructions on extraction techniques, concentration methods, and delivery systems. In return, Jacob had sent payments through cryptocurrency and detailed profiles of his intended victims. The emails were clinical, almost academic in their tone. For cardiac patients, onset should occur within 2 to 4 hours of ingestion. Symptoms will mimic natural heart failure. Recommend starting with test dose on secondary target to confirm potency before primary application. Whiskey is optimal delivery vehicle due to natural bitterness masking plant alkaloids. High-proof spirits also serve as preservative for extracted compounds. Success depends on victim consuming minimum 2 Ahs of prepared solution. Consider factors like body weight, existing conditions, concurrent medications. Reading those exchanges in court, surrounded by the formal ritual of justice, was surreal. These weren't the words of someone who'd lost control in a moment of rage. This was the language of someone who'd turned murder into a science project. The prosecution also revealed that Jacob had been practicing. 2 months before my birthday, he'd sent a bottle of wine to Sarah's new boyfriend in Arizona, a congratulations on the engagement gift that had arrived right after their announcement. The boyfriend, a firefighter named David Chen, had drunk half the bottle and ended up in the emergency room with what doctors had diagnosed as food poisoning. Only it wasn't food poisoning. It was a test run. Chen testified via video link, describing symptoms identical to Wesley's: nausea, cardiac irregularities, disorientation. He'd recovered because the dose had been lower. Jacob was still perfecting his technique. But the intent had been clear. If Chen had drunk the entire bottle, he would have died. "Your Honor," David Chen said from his Phoenix living room, his voice steady despite the subject matter, "I want to make sure the court understands something. Sarah and I had just gotten engaged. We were celebrating the future we were planning to build together, and someone, this defendant, tried to take that away because he couldn't accept that his ex-wife had moved on." The jury watched Jacob's face during that testimony. He showed no emotion, no recognition, no hint of remorse. If anything, he looked bored, as if Chen's near-death experience was an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Kellerman fought hard. He questioned the chain of custody on the evidence, suggested Wesley's collapse could have been coincidental, painted me as a bitter father, looking for someone to blame for years of family dysfunction. But the notebook was damning. Page after page of Jacob's handwriting, planning not just my death but the deaths of others. Names, addresses, methods. A systematic approach to eliminating everyone he felt had wronged him. And then there was the discovery that nearly broke my heart completely. During the third day of testimony, Prosecutor Amanda Walsh introduced Exhibit 47, a small leather journal found hidden behind a loose board in Jacob's basement workshop. Inside were pages of what could only be described as practice notes. Detailed observations of local residents' daily routines, health conditions, social habits. People Jacob had studied like a predator studies prey. Mrs. Henderson from down the street, age 74, diabetic, lived alone, grocery shopping every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Bill Kowalski from the hardware store, recovering from bypass surgery, liked to have a beer at Murphy's Tavern every Friday after work. Margie Santos from the post office, recently widowed, took her arthritis medication with orange juice every morning. Dozens of entries. An entire community reduced to vulnerabilities and opportunities. Your Honor, Prosecutor Walsh said, holding the journal open for the jury to see. This isn't the notebook of someone planning a single crime of passion. This is the work of someone who viewed his neighbors as potential victims, studying them like a hunter studies game. I sat in the gallery feeling sick. These weren't strangers Jacob had been cataloging. These were people who'd known him since childhood, people who'd waved to him on the street, asked about his job, invited him to barbecues and block parties. Mrs. Henderson had given him piano lessons when he was 7. Bill Kowalski had hired him for odd jobs during high school. Margie Santos had always made sure his packages were delivered safely when he wasn't home, and he'd repaid their kindness by studying how best to kill them. The most chilling entry was dated just 2 weeks before my birthday. FD, morning routine unchanged. Coffee at 6:30, toast with jam. Sits at kitchen table facing east window, alone, vulnerable. Whiskey delivery optimal. Nostalgic appeal will overcome health concerns. Estimate 4 to 6 hour window for full effect. Jacob had been watching me, learning my habits, calculating the exact moment when sentiment might overcome caution and convince me to take that fatal drink. The prosecution's psychiatric expert, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, explained to the jury what they were seeing. This level of planning, this systematic approach to multiple victims, indicates what we call instrumental aggression. The defendant wasn't killing in the heat of passion. He was using murder as a tool to solve problems he perceived in his social environment. Kellerman objected to the psychiatric testimony, claiming it was prejudicial speculation. But the judge allowed it, and I could see its impact on the jury. This wasn't just about one poisoned bottle anymore. It was about a community that had been living unknowingly under threat from someone they'd trusted. During cross-examination, Kellerman tried to suggest that the journal entries were creative writing exercises, and that the correspondence with Vance was academic research into historical poisoning cases. Dr. Rodriguez's response was devastating. Mr. Kellerman, creative writing doesn't typically include precise measurements, delivery schedules, and victim surveillance notes. Academic research doesn't involve purchasing actual toxins or practicing extraction techniques. What we see here is operational planning, detailed, methodical preparation for multiple homicides. The defense case lasted exactly 1 day. Kellerman called character witnesses who described Jacob as a troubled but fundamentally good person, who'd been devastated by his parents' inability to understand his struggles. They painted a picture of a young man driven to desperation by financial pressure and family rejection. But when Jacob took the stand in his own defense, something went wrong. Maybe it was the way Prosecutor Walsh questioned him, relentless but never raising her voice. Maybe it was the weight of all that evidence, all those careful plans exposed to daylight. Or maybe it was simply that Jacob couldn't resist showing how clever he thought he'd been. Mr. Dalton, Walsh said, you claim you never intended to harm anyone. That's correct. But you did purchase white snakeroot extract from Marcus Vance. For research purposes. Research into what? Historical poisoning cases. I was writing a novel. Walsh nodded, as if this made perfect sense. And this novel required you to actually produce poison? I wanted the details to be accurate. I see. And the notebook found in your workshop, with measurements, dosages, and victim profiles. That was also for your novel? Character development. Mr. Dalton, isn't it true that you told Mr. Vance in an email dated March 15th, and I quote, "The old man drinks his coffee every morning at the same time, same spot, creature of habit. When the time comes, it'll be like serving breakfast to a corpse?" The courtroom went dead silent. Jacob's face flushed, and for the first time since his arrest, he looked rattled. That was character dialogue. For the story. Whose character, Mr. Dalton? Because the email is signed with your real name, sent from your personal account, and references your father's actual morning routine. Jacob's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. In trying to explain away his communications with Vance, Jacob had revealed just how closely he'd been watching me, how personal this had become. Walsh pressed further. Mr. Dalton, in another email to Mr. Vance, you wrote, "Practice run successful. Target experienced expected symptoms but survived due to lower dosage. Adjusting formula for primary subject." Can you explain what that means? I don't recall that specific email. It's Exhibit 31, Mr. Dalton. Your email account, your words. What was this practice run you mentioned? Jacob's silence stretched until the judge instructed him to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I don't know what that refers to. But everyone in that courtroom knew. The practice run was David Chen, Sarah's fiancé, the man who'd nearly died from a bottle of poisoned wine. The primary subject was me. When Walsh finished her cross-examination, Jacob looked like a man who'd tried to build a house of cards in a windstorm. Every explanation had collapsed under the weight of his own documented words. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a voice that carried no emotion. Guilty on all counts. Jacob didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't show any reaction at all except for that slight tightening around his eyes that I'd learned to recognize when he was a boy trying not to cry over a scraped knee. But just before the bailiff led him away, he turned to look at me one final time. What I saw in his eyes wasn't remorse or love or even hatred. It was disappointment. As if I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. The judge sentenced him to life without parole, with an additional 20 years for each count of conspiracy to commit murder. The sentences would run consecutively, meaning Jacob would never see freedom again. But there was something else too. Something that made my skin crawl even as the bailiff's handcuffs clicked shut around Jacob's wrists. He smiled, just a tiny upturn at the corner of his mouth, barely visible unless you knew his face the way I did. The smile said, "This isn't over." 3 weeks after the verdict. You'd think that watching your son get sentenced to life in prison would be the end of the story, that justice served would equal peace restored, that the gavel falling would be the period at the end of a very dark sentence. You'd be wrong. The first sign that Jacob's conviction hadn't closed the book came on a Tuesday morning in November. I was sitting at my kitchen table, working through a crossword puzzle and enjoying the first truly quiet morning I'd had in months, when my phone rang. Mr. Dalton? The voice was unfamiliar, female, nervous. This is Detective Maria Santos with the Arizona Department of Public Safety. I'm calling about Jacob Dalton. My pen stopped moving. What about him? Sir, are you aware that your son has been communicating with individuals outside the prison? He's allowed phone calls, isn't he? These weren't phone calls, Mr. Dalton. These were coded letters. Letters that referenced unfinished business and included what appeared to be instructions for someone on the outside. The crossword puzzle blurred. 17 across. Betrayal among family. I'd been stuck on it for 20 minutes. Now the answer came to me with crystal clarity. Treachery. What kind of instructions? Sir, I think we need to have this conversation in person. Are you available to travel to Phoenix? Detective, just tell me. Is my son still trying to hurt people from prison? A pause. Mr. Dalton, we believe he may have activated what we're calling a dead man's switch, a plan that goes into effect if he's unable to carry it out himself. My blood went cold. Who's the target? His ex-wife Sarah, and her children. I was on a plane to Phoenix 18 hours later, my first time flying since Linda and I had visited her sister in Florida 8 years ago. The flight was smooth, but my hands shook through the entire 2-hour journey. Not from fear of flying, but from the growing realization that Jacob's conviction had been just the opening move in a longer, deadlier game. Detective Santos met me at the airport, a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of handshake that said she was used to being underestimated. She drove me straight to a safe house in Scottsdale, a nondescript ranch home surrounded by desert landscaping and unmarked surveillance vehicles. "Before you see them," she said, as we sat in her car outside the house, "you need to understand what we're dealing with. Jacob's been corresponding with at least 3 individuals on the outside. We've intercepted some of the letters, but we suspect others got through." She handed me a photocopy of a letter in Jacob's careful handwriting. "The old problems remain unsolved. The lessons I wanted to teach have been postponed, not canceled. Trust our friends to remember what loyalty means. The children especially need to understand consequences." The children, my grandchildren, a 6-year-old girl named Emma and an 8-year-old boy named Tyler, whom I'd seen exactly twice since Jacob's divorce. Brief, awkward visits where I'd brought toys they were too polite to say they didn't want. "Detective," I said, "when you say our friends, who are we talking about? We've identified 2 so far. Marcus Vance, the botanist, is still in the wind. But we arrested someone named Angela Moretti yesterday in Las Vegas. She's a former pharmaceutical technician who's been purchasing lab equipment and chemical supplies. Under questioning, she admitted to receiving instructions from Jacob to complete the project." Complete the project. My grandchildren reduced to a project, a problem to be solved with the same systematic approach Jacob had used to plan my murder. Inside the safe house, Sarah looked like a woman who'd been running for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still. She was thinner than I remembered, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dark circles under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. The children were in the backyard, playing on a swing set under the watchful eyes of 2 federal marshals who'd probably rather be chasing bank robbers than babysitting kids who didn't understand why they couldn't go home. "Frank?" Sarah said, standing when I walked in. "I'm sorry you had to come all this way." "I'm sorry it was necessary." We sat at the kitchen table while Detective Santos explained what they'd discovered. Jacob's letters weren't just threats, they were operational plans. Detailed instructions for accessing Sarah's apartment, the children's school schedules, even the route they took to the grocery store. "He's been planning this for months," Santos said, "even before his arrest. The poisoning attempt on you was just the beginning." Sarah's hands were clasped so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. "I should have seen it coming. The divorce wasn't friendly. He blamed me for everything. The job loss, the financial problems, even his drinking. Said I'd poisoned the kids against him, when all I did was try to protect them from his anger." "Protect them how?" I asked. "He'd get these rages, usually about money or work or something else that wasn't going his way. He never hit us, but he'd throw things, break dishes, punch walls. The kids would hide in their rooms until it was over." I thought about the boy I'd raised, the one who'd cried over a dead goldfish. "How long did this go on?" "The last 2 years of our marriage. Maybe longer, but that's when it got bad enough that I couldn't pretend it was just stress anymore." Detective Santos spread out copies of Jacob's letters on the table. "Mr. Dalton, we need you to look at these. You knew your son better than anyone. Is there anything in his language, his references, that might help us understand his timeline or his resources?" I studied the letters, looking for clues in handwriting I'd been reading for decades. Most of it was straightforward: instructions for surveillance, warnings about law enforcement attention, promises that the work would continue. But one letter stood out. It was addressed to someone called the chemist, and included a paragraph that made my stomach turn. The old man's survival was unfortunate but instructive. Next time, delivery must be more direct. Consider aerosol application or skin contact absorption. The children's smaller body mass requires adjusted calculations, but the principle remains the same. They trust easily. Use that. Jesus Christ, I whispered. He's talking about poisoning the kids. That's our interpretation, Santos said. And based on the timeline in his letters, we believe he planned to activate this dead man's switch within 30 days of his conviction. I looked through the sliding glass doors at my grandchildren. Emma was on the swing, blonde hair flying as she pumped her legs higher and higher. Tyler was digging in the sandbox, completely absorbed in whatever elaborate construction project occupied his 8-year-old mind. They looked so normal, so innocent, so completely unaware that their father had reduced them to entries in a murder notebook. What's the plan? I asked. We keep them here until we've rounded up Jacob's entire network. The FBI is coordinating with law enforcement in 6 states. But Mr. Dalton, Santos's voice grew softer. This could take months, maybe longer. That evening I sat with Sarah on the safe house porch, watching the Arizona sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and gold. The children were inside, playing board games with one of the marshals who'd turned out to have a talent for making Tyler laugh and letting Emma win at checkers. I need to ask you something, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. And I need you to be honest. Okay. Do you blame me? For the divorce? For taking the kids? For all of this? I thought about it. Really thought about it. Because the easy answer would have been no. Of course not. You did what you had to do. But Sarah deserved better than easy answers. I blame myself, I said finally. I raised him. I missed the signs. I let him become the kind of man who'd planned to murder his own children, rather than accept that he'd lost them. That's not an answer to my question. I turned to look at her. In the fading light, she looked younger, more like the woman Jacob had brought home to meet us 8 years ago. Back then, she'd been full of plans. Graduate school, a teaching career, a house with a garden where she could grow tomatoes and herbs. Jacob had systematically destroyed every one of those dreams. No, I said. I don't blame you. I blame him. And I blame whatever it is inside him that turned love into possession and disappointment into homicide. She nodded, tears tracking down her cheeks in the desert twilight. The hardest part isn't being afraid of him. It's grieving for the man I thought he was while staying alert for the man he actually became. That night, in the guest room of a safe house 2,000 miles from home, I lay awake thinking about legacy. What do you leave behind when your son's greatest achievement is a systematic plan to murder everyone who ever loved him? The answer came to me as the digital clock flipped to 3:17 a.m. You leave behind the people he didn't get to kill, the lives he didn't get to destroy, the future he didn't get to poison. Wesley Morrison, alive and recovering. David Chen, alive and planning a wedding. Sarah and the kids, frightened but breathing. Mrs. Henderson, still bringing in her mail every afternoon. Bill Kowalski, still sharing stories over beer at Murphy's. Margie Santos, still making sure packages find their way home. Maybe that was enough. Maybe survival was its own form of victory. But Jacob wasn't done teaching me lessons yet. The call came 3 days later while I was having breakfast with Emma and Tyler. Sarah had gone to the store with one of the marshals, and I was attempting to explain why orange juice and pancakes made a perfectly reasonable combination when Detective Santos's phone rang. She stepped into the next room, but her voice carried, "When? How many? Jesus, okay, I'll tell them." When she came back, her face was grim. "We found Marcus Vance." "Found him how?" "Dead. Apparent suicide in a motel room outside Tucson. But Mr. Dalton, before he died, he sent packages to 14 different addresses across the country. We're trying to intercept them, but some got through. 3, maybe 4, including one addressed to this house." My blood turned to ice water. "Here? How could he know about this place?" We're not sure. But Frank, we need to evacuate. Now. The next hour was chaos. Marshals moving with efficient urgency, packing bags and loading vehicles while bomb disposal experts examined every piece of mail that had been delivered to the safe house in the past week. Emma cried because she had to leave her new crayons behind. Tyler asked 17 questions about where we were going and why we had to hurry. Sarah held them both in the back seat of an unmarked SUV, whispering reassurances that sounded like prayers. It's going to be okay. We're just taking another little trip. Everything's going to be fine. But I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe it any more than I did. The second safe house was in Flagstaff, higher elevation, cooler air, surrounded by pine forests that reminded me of camping trips I'd taken with Jacob when he was the kid's age. The irony wasn't lost on me, running from my son to a place that looked like memories of when I'd still believed he might grow up to be a good man. Detective Santos briefed us that evening. The package Vance sent here contained enough concentrated ricin to kill everyone in this house twice over. It was disguised as a care package for the children. Toys, candy, coloring books. If we hadn't intercepted it, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The other packages? 2 were intercepted by local law enforcement, but one reached its destination before we could stop it. A woman named Jennifer Walsh in Denver, no relation to our prosecutor. She opened it yesterday morning. Is she? Critical condition. The package contained what appeared to be hand lotion. She applied it before realizing something was wrong. The toxin was absorbed through her skin. I closed my eyes. Jennifer Walsh. I didn't know her, had never heard her name before today. But somehow she'd ended up on Jacob's list of people who needed to die. Maybe she'd cut him off in traffic once. Maybe she'd been rude to him in a store. Maybe she'd simply existed in a way that offended his sense of how the world should work. It didn't matter. She was fighting for her life because my son had decided her death would send a message. What message? I asked Santos. That he can still reach anyone, anywhere, anytime. That prison walls don't limit his ability to hurt people. That cooperating with law enforcement doesn't guarantee safety. That night, I sat with Tyler on the safe house porch, both of us wrapped in blankets against the mountain cold. He was working on a puzzle, a picture of a lighthouse standing against a stormy sea, while I pretended to read a magazine I'd found on the coffee table. Grandpa Frank? Tyler said without looking up from his puzzle. Yeah, buddy? Is my dad a bad man? The question hit me like a physical blow. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his father has become a monster? That the man who used to read him bedtime stories and push him on swings now spends his days planning the boy's death? Your dad is sick, I said finally. Sick in a way that makes him want to hurt people. Can he get better? I thought about Jacob's smile in that courtroom, the cold calculation in his eyes, the systematic way he'd planned multiple murders. I don't think so, Tyler. I think he's too sick to get better. Tyler nodded and went back to his puzzle. After a few minutes, he found the piece he'd been looking for, part of the lighthouse's foundation, and pressed it into place with the satisfied precision of someone who understands that some things can be fixed if you're patient enough to find the right fit. If only it were that simple with people. The breakthrough came 2 days later, when the FBI arrested Angela Moretti attempting to board a flight to Mexico City. In her luggage, they found documents that revealed the true scope of Jacob's dead man's switch. 17 targets across 12 states, each one carefully selected from his years of perceived grievances. But Moretti provided something even more valuable: the location of Marcus Vance's workshop. It turned out that Vance hadn't been working alone either. Hidden in a storage unit outside Phoenix, investigators found a sophisticated laboratory capable of producing industrial quantities of various toxins. They also found records indicating that Jacob's project was just one of several similar operations Vance had been running across the Southwest. It's a network, Detective Santos explained during a briefing that included FBI agents, state police, and federal prosecutors. Vance was essentially running a murder-for-hire service specializing in deaths that would appear natural. Jacob was both a client and a student. The scope was staggering. Over the past 3 years, Vance's network had been linked to at least 30 suspicious deaths across 7 states. Wealthy elderly people whose heirs had grown impatient, business partners who'd become inconvenient, spouses who'd threatened divorce proceedings. All of them had died from apparent natural causes: heart attacks, strokes, sudden organ failures. All of them had been carefully selected victims whose deaths would trigger minimal investigation. "Your son was special," Santos continued. "Most of Vance's clients wanted clean, professional eliminations. Jacob wanted to do it himself. He wanted to be hands-on. That's what made him so dangerous. And that's what had saved my life. If Jacob had simply hired Vance to kill me, I'd probably be dead. But he'd wanted the satisfaction of doing it himself. The personal touch of selecting the whiskey, preparing the poison, hand-delivering what he thought would be my final birthday gift. His need for control had been his downfall. But even from prison, that need for control was still driving him to find ways to finish what he'd started. The final confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. 2 weeks after Moretti's arrest, while the children were still in protective custody and investigators were still unraveling Vance's network, Jacob found a way to make contact with Sarah directly. It started with a phone call to the safe house. The caller ID showed a local number, and Sarah answered, thinking it might be one of the marshals calling with an update. "Hello, Sarah." Jacob's voice, calm and conversational, as if he were calling to discuss weekend plans instead of speaking from a maximum security prison. Sarah dropped the phone like it had caught fire. The marshals traced the call immediately. It had been routed through a series of proxy servers and voice modulation software, making it nearly impossible to track in real time. But the message was clear. Jacob could reach us whenever he wanted. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room with her favorite stuffed elephant, a ratty pink thing she'd had since she was 2, asking questions that had no good answers. Why doesn't Daddy love us anymore? What did we do wrong? When can we go home? Sarah held her daughter close, making promises she wasn't sure she could keep. None of this is your fault. Daddy is sick, and sick people sometimes do things that don't make sense. We're going to be safe. But I could see the doubt in Sarah's eyes. How do you promise safety when the threat comes from someone who'd once vowed to protect these children with his life? The next morning brought news that changed everything. Jennifer Walsh, the woman in Denver who'd been poisoned by Vance's final package, had died during the night. Her death wasn't just another tragedy. It was evidence that Jacob's network was still operational, still deadly, still committed to finishing what they'd started. "That's 8 people now," Detective Santos told me during a private conversation outside the safe house. 8 people dead or nearly dead because your son couldn't accept that the world didn't owe him what he thought he deserved. What's the plan now? We move the family again, somewhere Jacob can't trace, and we prepare for the possibility that this doesn't end until everyone in his network is behind bars or dead. Or until he is, I said. Santos studied my face. "Mr. Dalton, are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact. As long as Jacob's alive, as long as he can think and plan and communicate, Sarah and those kids will never be safe. You know it. I know it. Hell, Jacob knows it too." That afternoon I asked to speak with Jacob directly. Not a visit. I had no intention of traveling to Missouri to sit across from him in a prison visiting room. But the FBI had ways of facilitating secure communications when necessary. The call was arranged for 6 p.m., routed through enough security protocols to satisfy everyone involved. When Jacob's voice came through the speaker in the FBI field office, it sounded exactly the same as it had that night he'd called to ask about the whiskey. "Hello, Dad. Jacob. I hear you've been busy, playing protector to people who don't deserve it. I'm playing protector to children who don't deserve to die for your wounded pride." A laugh, soft and genuinely amused. "You always were sentimental about kids. Remember when you used to take me camping? You'd tell me stories about honor and doing the right thing. Funny how that worked out. What do you want, Jacob? I want you to understand that this ends one of 2 ways. Either Sarah brings my children home where they belong, or they learn the same lesson I tried to teach you. They're not your children anymore. You gave up that right when you put their names in a murder notebook. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had gone cold. They'll always be mine, Dad. Blood doesn't change just because a judge signs papers. And I'll reach them eventually. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually. Not if I have anything to say about it. You won't. Because sooner or later you'll make a mistake. You'll let your guard down. You'll trust the wrong person or go to the wrong place at the wrong time. And when that happens, the line went dead. I sat in the FBI office, staring at the silent phone, feeling like I'd just spoken to a ghost. Not because Jacob was dead, but because the person I'd just talked to bore no resemblance to anyone I'd ever known or raised or loved. That version of my son was gone. Had been gone for years, probably. What remained was something else entirely. A calculating intelligence focused entirely on revenge, unrestrained by conscience or love or any recognition of other people's right to exist. Detective Santos had been listening to the call from another room. When she came back, her expression was grim. "We're moving the family again," she said. "Tonight. And Mr. Dalton, you need to consider the possibility that you're not safe either. That call wasn't just a threat to Sarah and the children. It was a threat to anyone who stands between Jacob and what he wants." "Let him try," I said. "I'm 71 years old and I've already lived longer than most men get to. But those kids, they've got their whole lives ahead of them. Then help us make sure they get to live them." The third safe house was in Montana, a cabin in the wilderness so remote it didn't appear on most maps. No cell service, no internet, no way for Jacob or his network to track us electronically. The FBI called it going dark, complete isolation until the threat could be neutralized. For the children, it was an adventure. Emma collected pine cones and named them like pets. Tyler spent hours building forts out of fallen branches and exploring the creek that ran behind the cabin. They missed their friends and their school and their normal life. But they adapted the way children do, finding joy in the immediate moment, even when the larger picture was too frightening to contemplate. For Sarah, it was purgatory. Cut off from her job, her support system, her entire adult life, she spent her days in a state of controlled anxiety that was exhausting to watch. She played games with the kids, read them stories, maintained the routines that helped them feel secure. But in the quiet moments between activities, I could see her calculating. How long could this go on? How long before the children started asking harder questions? How long before isolation became its own form of prison? For me, it was a revelation. Living in that cabin, surrounded by federal agents and my son's intended victims, I began to understand something I'd never grasped before. The true cost of Jacob's crimes wasn't just the people who died or nearly died. It was the ripple effect. The lives disrupted, the trust destroyed, the simple assumption of safety that most people take for granted. Emma couldn't sleep without checking her closet for monsters, even though she'd never been afraid of the dark before. Tyler had started hoarding food under his bed, terrified that meals might suddenly stop coming. Sarah jumped every time a pine bough scraped against the cabin windows, and I found myself checking the locks obsessively, the same behavior that had kept me alive in Korea, but felt excessive in what should have been the safety of federal protection. We were all learning to live like prey animals, alert to every sound, suspicious of every stranger, unable to fully relax even in the presence of armed guards. That was Jacob's real legacy. Not the deaths he'd caused, but the fear he'd implanted in everyone who'd survived him. 3 weeks into our Montana exile, the news came that I'd been both dreading and hoping for. Careful calculation of dosages. They brought in experts who explained how white snake root worked, how it attacked the cardiovascular system, how it could be made virtually undetectable in a strongly flavored spirit. Kellerman fought hard. He questioned the chain of custody on the evidence, suggested Wesley's collapse could have been coincidental, painted me as a bitter father looking for someone to blame for years of family dysfunction. But the notebook was damning. Page after page of Jacob's handwriting, planning not just my death, but the deaths of others. Names, addresses, methods. A systematic approach to eliminating everyone he felt had wronged him. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a voice that carried no emotion. Guilty on all counts. Jacob didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't show any reaction at all except for that slight tightening around his eyes that I'd learned to recognize when he was a boy trying not to cry over a scraped knee. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. As they led him away, Jacob finally looked at me. Just for a moment across that crowded courtroom, father and son made eye contact one last time. What I saw there wasn't remorse or love or even hatred. It was disappointment, as if I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. 6 months later, Wesley Morrison recovered fully, though he never developed a taste for whiskey again. Carolyn sends me a Christmas card every year, signed with gratitude that feels heavier than it should. Detective Reyes got promoted to sergeant and still stops by occasionally, usually with coffee and conversation that carefully avoids the topic of family. I still live in the same house, though I've updated the locks and installed a security system that probably costs more than it should. The kitchen table where that bottle once sat now holds my morning coffee and the newspaper. Nothing more dramatic than crossword puzzles and local weather forecasts. Sometimes late at night I think about visiting Jacob in prison. The facility is only 2 hours north, and I imagine the conversation we might have through bulletproof glass. What I'd say, what he'd say back, whether there's any explanation that could make sense of what he tried to do. But I never make the drive. Because some doors, once closed, are meant to stay that way. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal, even with time and forgiveness, and all the things people say you owe to family. Jacob chose poison over conversation. He chose my death over his pride. Those aren't the choices of someone who lost his way temporarily. They're the choices of someone who never learned that love isn't something you can demand at gunpoint. I keep the mason jar in my safe now. Empty, but not forgotten. Sometimes evidence becomes memorial. Sometimes the thing that almost killed you becomes the thing that reminds you why living matters. Last week, I received another package in the mail. No return address, no note. Inside was a single photograph. Jacob in his prison uniform, standing in what looked like a workshop, holding a small vial up to the light. On the back, someone had written, "Still learning." I burned the photograph in my backyard fire pit and watched the smoke carry the ashes up into the evening sky. Then I went inside, poured myself a glass of sweet tea, and sat on my porch swing as the sun set over the county road. Tomorrow I'll visit Wesley and Carolyn. We'll sit on their porch and talk about the weather, maybe plan a fishing trip for when the bass start biting again. Normal things. Safe things. Things that don't require testing or evidence bags or men in uniforms taking notes. But tonight, I'll just sit here and listen to the peaceful sounds of a world where my son can't reach me. Where the only thing in my glass is what I put there myself. Where trust, once broken, has been replaced by something more valuable. The knowledge that I'm still here to tell the story. And sometimes, that's enough. The investigation later revealed that Jacob had been planning similar attacks on 4 other people, using different methods and different poisons. Wesley Morrison's survival, and my decision to give away the whiskey instead of drinking it myself, prevented what law enforcement called a methodical elimination campaign. Jacob Dalton is currently serving life without parole at Jefferson City Correctional Center. He has filed 2 unsuccessful appeals and continues to maintain his innocence, despite overwhelming evidence. This story serves as a reminder that the people closest to us are sometimes the ones capable of the greatest harm. Trust carefully, question generously, and never ignore the voice in your gut that whispers, "Something's wrong." Because sometimes that voice is the only thing standing between you and a gift you were never meant to survive. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, Please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us bring you more true crime stories that explore the dark corners of human nature and the resilience of those who survive them. What would you have done in Frank's situation? Would you have given the bottle away, or would curiosity have gotten the better of you? Let us know in the comments. Your perspectives on these moral dilemmas help shape future content. For more stories like this one, check out our channel, where we explore what happens when the people we trust most become the people we should fear. The next story in our series involves a father who discovered her son's deadly secret hidden in a recipe box that had been passed down for generations. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous gifts come wrapped in love.